Let's talk about peer review in much more detail. So, when it comes to peer review, once again, you don't need a job offer, fellowship grant, or anything, but you have to satisfy certain criteria when it comes to what you do as a researcher, what is your background, and even your kind of network and who can recommend you. So, I'm going to make it bigger and we're going to go in. For the peer review route, there is what's called mandatory criteria. So, without this, you are not going to even be considered under the peer review. There is two things that you need to have before you decide to apply for this. Number one, you need to be an active researcher, for example, in a university, a research institute, or industry. And number two, you need to have a PhD or equivalent research experience. When they say an active researcher, what do they mean? Normally, this is someone who works as a researcher. They have a job title called research fellow, research assistant, research manager, I don't know, director of R&D, etc. So it could be both at university research institute or in the industry. But the important bit is that you have a researcher part of your job title. So it's not a policy analyst or something like this. They want to see researcher, maybe scientist, etc. And then there is a second bit to this title, which is an active researcher. What that means is sometimes people have had 15 years of experience in career and they have been an active researcher up until a certain point. But for the last 2-3 years, you haven't produced anything. So you will then lose that active bit of the researcher, meaning you haven't produced any research papers, publications, or anything like that in the last couple of years. And I have seen, unfortunately, rejections for quite senior people in their field, where the latest published paper was in 2020. So you need to be an active researcher. And a second bit, you need to have a PhD or equivalent research experience. If you have PhD, great, you satisfy mandatory criteria and we move on to what happens after. If you don't have a PhD, you have to prove them that you have equivalent research experience. It's slightly different to just being an active researcher. It's basically to counter absence of PhD. So they say, oh, not everyone has time or mood or whatever for PhD. We can give it to you if you have an equivalent research experience. And I actually have the official definition from the endorsing body what they consider an equivalent research experience. So equivalent research experience means significant time spent leading or undertaking a research. This would mean 3 years of consolidated research time where you have been the intellectual drive behind the project and achieved strong outputs from your research efforts. Basically, outcomes, what could be outcomes? Maybe you got invented something, or there is a patent, or there is some published papers, or as a result of it, you received a grant and you started researching further, etc. Basically, we need to find 3 years outside of your studies, of anything that you've spent in a research capacity where you have been the main intellectual drive and you have research. If you don't have those two things, unfortunately, you will not be able to apply for the peer review route. If you do have, great, we move on to the next stage, is you have provided the required documents to be considered for the assessment. When they say required documents, they mean this section here. The required documents are, you have the application form, you have the CV, 3 pages, guys. I'm going to talk about it in a separate about the CV, but just telling you because today I've seen a person with 25 pages of their CV. Then a letter of personal recommendation for both promise and talent. And if you're a talent, also a second letter of objective assessment. So this is the minimum required documents that you can provide, mandatory. And then your application will be forwarded to experts to decide or determine whether your application demonstrates talent or promise, and it will be assessed under the peer review solely on the required evidence provided as part of your application. Peer reviewers will be asked if there is any conflict of interest, and another reviewer will be asked to comment instead. Each application is assessed independently by relevant experts. The endorsing bodies cannot advise on the likelihood that your application will be endorsed. The peer review assessment will consider the following criteria to determine whether you're a talent or a promise. Number one, your track record, career history, and contribution to the field to date, including the significance of your publication, prizes and research funding awarded, patents, licenses, spin-outs, or any other form of intellectual property, and the impact of past innovation activity in organization, academia, or as an individual. The strengths of supporting statements in the letters of personal recommendation and in the second mandatory letter, and the expected benefits of your presence in the UK in terms of your contribution to UK in research innovation excellence. You satisfied these two criteria, you have one or two letters depending on promise or talent, and then they would be looking at these three things. So they basically are saying, good, your discipline is eligible, you have a PhD, you're an active researcher. Let's look at actually how advanced or outstanding your work is and international standing. What about your publications? Have you had any prizes? Do you have any fundings? Do you have any patents? Do you have any intellectual property? I will talk about it in evidence pieces, how to present that, because in fact, you can support your application with more documents. And they will look at your letters and also the benefits to the UK. This is usually part of your letters, is really important bit. And I have seen people rejected because they said, well, you're a great researcher, but we don't see how your presence in the UK will add anything because you haven't mentioned any of those things. And this is pretty much it when it comes to the peer review route. Now let's go more detail into each of those documents, including the evidence pieces.